Greetings. I'm Dr. Thomas Behr, Director of Liberal Studies, and I'm pleased to participate in this course of yours as you survey the range of approaches, methodologies, and objectives that the different disciplines have across the academy in the study of culture. My discipline is intellectual history. That's a subdiscipline of history, and history as a social science or humanities looks to study human actions in the past, and generally speaking, to study those actions over a period of time. Intellectual history studies ideas in the past and considers ideas actions, human actions in themselves, as we'll discuss further. And those two ideas are generally looked at over time, and that is in their variability, and what ideas succeed and flourish in a given society and which ones struggle. The range of approaches that historians of ideas or culture basically spans the philosophical spectrum. And just to give some intimation of the various approaches that have been used, we can see on one end, so to speak, of the philosophical spectrum, you have the more traditional approach to the history, to intellectual history, and frequently called the history of ideas. Ideas are given a kind of priority as the object of study, and we see still in the academy today instances of this approach in philosophy departments, economics departments, social scientific departments, even art historical departments, where the history of ideas related to those disciplines is still kind of explored, and courses are offered on the history of ideas in those disciplines. The approach that history of ideas takes looks at the development of ideas over time, diachronically, right? Means over time. And it has idealistic premises to it. The philosophical assumptions behind this approach assume that ideas have a kind of life of their own. There's also an assumption that ideas are evolving or progressing unilinearly, right? That ideas are getting more and more good, to put it perhaps simply. What good would look like, we'll talk more about. A famous recent case of this, of course, is Francis Fukuyama's famous end of history thesis, in which he assumed that the evolution of political ideologies had reached a kind of conclusion, and the optimum political ideology or way of thinking about politics had settled on liberal democratic pluralism as the form that had won out, so to speak, over the others, and around which the rest of the world was going to coalesce. Well, this made a certain sense after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the chief competitor to liberal democratic pluralism failed in the Soviet system. But the ideas having a life of their own certainly was found problematic just a decade after or so the fall of the Berlin Wall, with 9/11, and rethinking was required or whatever of this notion. And Samuel Huntington's famous book, The Clash of Cultures, pointed out that ideological conflicts aren't the only kinds of conflicts, that there may be irreconcilable cultural conflicts around which any kind of agreement might be problematic. Well, the other end of the philosophical spectrum, so to speak, is cultural history or sociocultural history. And those terms mean a lot of things to different practitioners, but they all share certain assumptions about what culture is and how it works, how to study it, and why to study it. There's a shift in cultural history away from the emphasis on elite culture, elite intellectual products like history of philosophy or history of scientific ideas, to the study of popular culture. So part of the reason for this shift is itself historical. Is mass culture in the 19th and 20th centuries in particular became more and more a prominent facet of modern life, and elite culture has been relativized in that new context. The cultural historians apply social scientific methods, sociology, anthropology in particular, to historical periods with less emphasis on the evolution of ideas over time, but more focus on the synchronic, that is, within one time period, how the culture works in a kind of complex of social scientific factors. The way this cultural complex works, also there's a theoretical shift from the history of ideas approach. History of ideas assumed that culture was produced by elites, elite intellectuals, political elites perhaps, and then that those ideas were disseminated somehow through a process sometimes called vulgarization, that is, moving out among the people. And in that process of vulgarization, it would have been expected that ideas might get confused and misappropriated somehow. But the cultural historical approach looks at culture in less unidirectional terms and has offered the term circularity to describe how culture moves within a given society, that there's a fairly constant interaction between groups and cultural ideas, and that there's a complex of things going on at any one time. In such a way, it's almost misleading or misconceived to talk about culture in any given society, but cultures. And each person, at an extreme, we could say each person has a culture of their own. There's problems with this approach. This is a structural approach that has certain materialistic premises about how the universe is and how we are. And the chief problem with such structuralisms is they have difficulty accounting for how culture changes. The process of circularity has only limited explanatory value. If the system of possible ideas is set within a social complex or sociocultural complex, it's hard to explain how ideas change, how some cultural paradigms die out and others come into existence and succeed. What's missing from the structuralisms is an accounting, or at least an adequate accounting perhaps, for the role of free will in human agency, the activity of individuals within cultural complexes to change their own ideas. Well, that brings us to the middle kind of approach to the study of ideas, which is my own, which could be called an ideas in context approach. This is also known as historical realism and derives in large part from the understanding and theories that Aristotle offered in the 4th century BC. concerning the universe, human nature, and how people act. You might think, and students are often assuming that the range of what's thinkable about these things is vast, and who knows, and it's all up maybe for grabs. But the range of what thinkable is in fact set. It's a spectrum of possible understandings of the basic questions that govern human thinking and action. And that ranges from strict materialist to strict idealist. Right? The strict materialist who asserts that nothing is real but bits of matter, and the strict idealist who asserts that nothing is real but absolute spirit, and all the material things are types of illusions, whereas the strict materialist says all of our intellectual or spiritual things are types of illusions. And the realist in the middle, following Aristotle, suggests that everything is a combination, so to speak, of both material causes but also ideal causes that make a thing what it is. What are these basic questions that govern not only the operation of culture in a society, but governs how different academic disciplines approach the study of culture? Because every scientist, and social scientists and are scientists also, philosophers are scientists, must have some theories about the object that they're studying. Otherwise, they wouldn't know what to look for, and they wouldn't know how to explain how things are happening. Right? So these theories are indispensable as axioms to all scientific pursuits, but also the study of culture. And the basic questions that the scientist has to have answers to govern their inquiry is, number one, what's the nature of the universe? And we have the materialist to idealist range of answers. What's the nature of human beings? You might call that the anthropological question, or the biological question, or the psychological question. But there has to be a range of answers to that, and that too spans the materialist to idealist spectrum. And finally, perhaps the most important question that a scientist and every person has to have an answer to is, what do we have to do to be happy? And that too spans the materialist to idealist range of what's possible to think. But it's right, the answer to that ultimate question, what human beings have to do to be happy, that prioritizes all of our actions. If we didn't have answers to these questions as scientists or as human beings, right, we wouldn't know how to act. It's the software. The answers to these questions are basically the software of human action, and they might never be explicit, but we have to have at least implicit answers to these questions as human agents. Well, if this is an approach both for scientists but also now in this understanding of how culture works, we understand that ideas have consequences. Right? There's another kind of circularity, the circularity of thought and action. Right? That individuals and groups of people, governed as they are by these paradigms, right? Cultural paradigms, if you want to call them that, act within those contexts, but then change the context. And this is where the dynamic or morphological aspect of culture has its source, is human agents acting subjectively within objective contexts. And the interaction of individual subjective behavior and the given context historically then can change over time. And of course, that would require detailed study of given ideas and their influences on the world around them. Where do we look on the context around them? Where do we look for the relevant contexts to study, right, within which ideas are operating? There's several different approaches to this, and different intellectual historians might focus on different of these contexts. But largely it's divided between personal contexts, right, that you might say the author's biography, right, their life, and you might look at the development of their own ideas, and we look at the body of their writings, the corpus of their writings, to see how ideas have changed within one person's thinking. And the other big side of the equation is the sociocultural, sociopolitical, socioeconomic context, which you might consider to be the demand side of the marketplace of ideas. Right? Ideas are operating in a society a little bit like a commodity that gets consumed. We don't often think of ideas as commodities or as technologies that are put into use, but that's what creates an environment in which particular ideas come to the fore and flourish. And right, we can do surveys or something like that to see the shift of ideas, and it's because somehow they respond to demands, interests, requirements of people in that society. On one, let's say the extreme side, you have ideological interest groups in political context, right, that have vested interests as a group for advancing particular ideas that serve their interests as a group, economic interest, cultural interest, or political interest. But what other factors cause ideas to change? Well, there's economic cycles that are independent of human action. So besides human agency, there's things at work that are impersonal forces that affect the context within which ideas operate, and therefore affect the demand or the supply for certain ideas. And the big factors in historical change, right, first and foremost are probably these economic cycles that are driven by three different factors. The first is climate. Right? The climate is largely, up until modern times, completely out of people's control, although in the past people have affected the climate as well, have affected their geography and you know, things like silting up of rivers and deforestation is a very old phenomenon. But the general effect of climate change is when temperatures are warmer, there's more food, and therefore population grows naturally without anybody planning, right? Because there's higher fertility rates and lower mortality rates. And with more people and increased population density, there's a historical and reasonably certain connection with technological development. Right? With population density, people are able to specialize. You have, right, the division of labor and specialization. And population continues to grow as a result. Up to the point where you get Malthus's famous law of population suggests, right, that technology can only increase, let's say, food production, which is the chief concern here, at an arithmetic rate, while population tends to increase on a geometric, exponential rate. And so if you look at the chart, Malthus's chart of population and agricultural production, you see recurrent Malthusian scissors as population outstrips food production, and crisis and conflict ensues, including poor health and plagues and things like that, as nutritional supplies are reduced. And the third factor is intersocietal interaction, which occurs anytime that there's societies next to each other or find out about each other, and that intersocietal interaction can be peaceful in trade. It can be peaceful also in terms of migration, right? Immigration is sometimes quite welcome, but also that intersocietal interaction can be violent, and what forms those intersocietal interactions take place are themselves, part of historical context that vary from time to time. There's no one rule. The other big objective force at work in the history of ideas, in intellectual history, are political cycles. Right? This is another aspect of the demand side of the marketplace of ideas. The Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, and Romans, Polybius and Cicero, and modern political theorists such as Montesquieu and Tocqueville have studied and reasoned about what seems to be a tendency for political regimes to degenerate, right? As groups of people in power get a sense of entitlement and abuse their authority. Right? Famously, Lord Acton said something that's also found in the Bible, the Old Testament, right, the book of Samuel, that power tends to corrupt, and so we witness historically regimes, political regimes, that come together out of unstable situations. Right, might establish a monarchy, but monarchy tends to degenerate into tyranny, and that the tyrant gets overthrown by an aristocracy, the strong men that are around the king and in a position to risk everything to overthrow the tyrant. Right, their lives, their liberty and sacred honor, their lives and fortunes and sacred honor. But the aristocracy tends to degenerate as it gets a sense of entitlement and abuses its authority into not a government by the best, but government by the few and by the rich, by the powerful. That's oligarchy or plutocracy. They get overthrown by the people who, are able to form factions. It's historically, it's not uncommon for some of the oligarchs to lead the democratic overthrow of the plutocracy. But democracies, all the classical political theorists thought had a tendency towards anarchy. And in each of those political shifts, right, the old ideas get thrown out, the old paradigms that governed political behavior, social behavior and action, and new ones come to the fore. So in political cycles, we see the very much important context within which ideas change because of subjective human choices. So the marketplace of ideas are affected by supply and demand and cultural hegemony of the current political elite or economic cultural elite has a role of its own, right? People can propagate ideas that serve their interests and can punish ideas that are contrary to the interests of some political elite. The economic trends and social trends and political trends are all interdependent. And so when we look at what ideas are on top at a given time and place, it doesn't hurt to use the crime detectives key clue or where to start looking for suspects with cui bono, who benefits. Right? If we see the triumph of certain ideas, we want to look at who has a at stake, who has an interest, economic, political, or whatever, in promoting such ideas. Okay, now we come to a case study. Okay, that was probably too much information on intellectual history and the historical realist approach to the study of ideas. But we can make it a little more concrete now by looking at a specific case. And I've chosen an important essay written by the philosopher Immanuel Kant in 1784. Now, those of you with some historical knowledge will recognize that, oh, that's just, you know, a few years before the French Revolution. And Kant has written this essay called What is Enlightenment? In the context of really over a century-long debate in Europe and in the colonies in America about the nature of the modern world and how to think about it. And subsequent thinkers gave the name, the Enlightenment, to this era from the late 17th century to at least the end of the 18th century, right, the 1700s, to describe this period of history when ideas took a dramatic shift away from classical and largely Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman answers to the basic philosophical religious questions in the whole society that was the home to those cultural paradigms, to modern society and a whole set of modern ideas about the universe, human nature, and what we have to do to be happy. So Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, was actually a part of a shorter-term discussion among intellectuals, European intellectuals, especially German and French, but also in England, about you know, where are we going? You know, what is this Enlightenment? And there was quite heated debates. Most people were on Kant's side of the equation, but there were some intellectuals even at the time that saw problems with Kant's approach to the world. Well, how do we proceed? And the first step for, I would believe, any intellectual historian, from the the idealist historian of ideas to the more materialistic structural sociocultural historian, is we have to read the text carefully. Right? Of course, sociocultural historians would probably not look so much at a text like this, the product of an elite intellectual and that figured in a debate within an elite circle of intellectuals. But we're in that middle zone, right, that suggests elite ideas matter, but they exist within historical structures and context that both affect the origin and rise of these ideas, and then the ideas that then affect the context around them and change them. So having read this, right, you've looked at this, our objective is a close reading of the text, and Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book, it gives a very good analysis of how that can be done. And what we're looking to understand is, first of all, you know, what is the text saying? And as non-scholars, we're going to rule out many of the very sophisticated and subtle let's say, potential problems with translation or with the meaning of original words even. And so we're going to look just at what the text says with a kind of naivete, at least to start with. And then we want to look at how the text is saying it. What's the rhetoric of the text? How is the text looking to persuade us? And finally, we want to get an understanding of what difference does this text make. That's the let's say really interesting question, is what effect did this text have on the contexts around it? And as a historian, that would be our chief interest. You know, both retrospectively, where did these ideas come from, and prospectively, what effect did they have on the rest of the historical context. A philosopher would have a different interest in what difference does it make. Right? The philosopher would ask the question, is there any truth in it? And, well, it doesn't hurt to be a little bit of a philosopher when you're studying these things. And, okay, so the process, close reading. The first thing is to identify what seem to be the key terms. This is a philosophical, right, expository writing, and so it's going to have a developed argument and try to argue a case, right, as an expository work. But the argument is made up of key propositions, and key propositions are made up of key terms. So in our close reading, we need to identify either, you know, starting from an understanding of the argument and working back to key terms, or starting with key terms and working up to understanding the argument. So obviously, right, enlightenment is a key term, and we need to know what this means. Right? How do you understand what a term means in a text? From its context. Right? The key terms are going to be terms that an author is using in a special way. And so Kant tells us enlightenment is, right? Enlightenment is man's release from his self-incurred tutelage. Self-incurred tutelage is another key term, right? We don't know exactly what it means, but we need to know what it means because it seems to be the basis of the whole argument, right? A release from that will be enlightenment. Kant is good to us, and in the next sentence he tells us tutelage is man's inability to make use of his understanding without direction from another. So tutelage is essentially being under the influence of another in the use of your understanding. Let's see. The next key term, right, would be these mysterious guardians. This is at the bottom of page 1 in our text. Right, that step to competence is held to be very dangerous. Right, the step to enlightenment, very dangerous, and that's right. That people are kept to believe that it's dangerous, that enlightenment is dangerous, by those guardians who have so kindly assumed superintendence over them. So these guardians obviously are playing a key role, a key term. And let's say the ultimate key term, right, if we look at the bottom of page 2 in the text, right, for enlightenment to happen, nothing is required but freedom. This is a powerful proposition, right? Freedom as a key term. The proposition for enlightenment to happen, nothing is required but freedom, seems to be a very, very powerful proposition and part of the argument. But we see in the subsequent paragraph on page 3 that there's two kinds of freedom to use one's reason. Right? It's the freedom, still at the bottom of page 2, it's the freedom to make public use of one's reason at every point. That's what's required. Public use of one's reason. And we have to find out what that is. Because on the top of page 3, that first full paragraph, he says private use of one's reason which one may make of it in a particular civil post or office, which is entrusted to him. And that private use can be very, the private use of reason, on the other hand, may often be very narrowly restricted. So here's the important distinction. Public use has to be free. Private use of reason can be very narrowly restricted. Let's put these together now in some of the propositions that make up the argument, right? Going back to page 1, where does this tutelage come from, right? The proposition that our self-incurred tutelage is the product of laziness and cowardice. Right? That's why it's self-incurred. It's our own fault. In that, right, release from that adulthood, so to speak, is prevented by these guardians. And we looked a little bit at that already. We'll have to figure out more who these guardians are. And at the bottom of page 2, where he's talked about, right, for enlightenment, nothing is required but freedom, and it's the freedom to make public use of one's reason at every point. But he raises another proposition that we have to figure out. He says, "But I hear on all sides, do not argue." The officer says, "Do not argue, but drill." The tax collector says, "Do not argue, but pay." The cleric says, "Do not argue, but believe." Now, that quote is frequently mentioned in the textbooks of Western civilization or history of ideas or whatever, quite out of context, as if Kant thought that these were bad things, right? That the officer says, "Do not argue but drill," tax collector, "Do not argue but pay," and the cleric, "Do not argue but believe." Where in fact, as we'll come to understand, right, those, let's say, mandated obediences are necessary in the private use of one's reason. And that's clear already in the sentence following those mandated obediences, where Kant explains only one prince in the world says, "Argue as much as you will and about what you will, but obey." Everywhere there's restriction on freedom, right? But one prince gets it right, right? You can have freedom to argue, it seems, as long as you obey. And that already kind of raises the question, obey whom? Well, the prince, right, that Kant refers to. So what is public use of reason versus the private use, right? Kant defines that for us, right? Public use of one's reason, I understand the use in which a person makes of it as a scholar, right? As a scholar, before the reading public. So there's two conditions required for the public use of one's reason, which should be free and which will lead to enlightenment. And those two conditions are, it can be exercised by only scholars and only in a venue among literate people, right? We might see a kind of paternalism here, right? That scholars get a kind of monopoly on the use of reason, and average people can't be entrusted to hear debates of this sort. The private use that can be very narrowly restricted, on the other hand, is of reason, is that which one may make of it in a particular civil post or office. Going on, many affairs which are conducted in the interest of the community require a certain mechanism through which some members of the community must passively conduct themselves with an artificial unanimity, so that the government, right, here's who we obey, so that the government may direct them to public ends, or at least prevent them from destroying those ends. Here argument is certainly not allowed. One must obey. Well, what seems to be the paradox of freedom of the use of one's reason by intellectuals and for the literate public, and the requirement for obedience in political life is not a paradox that Kant finds objectionable. Now there's a fairly lengthy passage on page 4 and 5 on religious freedom of religious debate, right? And that too is reserved not for pastors while they're in their pulpits preaching, but when they're talking to students or publishing in journals, they can debate theological items. But they too, when it comes to their office in the pulpit, they need to obey. But we're more interested in the bigger question beyond, let's say, just religious freedom of conscience, which is a crucial one, of course. Let me back up to page 6. All right, let's see. Oh, 5. Okay, where it makes transition to his conclusion. If we are asked, bottom of page 5, do we now live in an enlightened age? The answer is no. But do we live in an age of enlightenment? As things now stand, much is lacking which prevents men from being, or easily becoming, capable of using their own reason in religious matters with assurance and free from outside direction. So even in religious matters, Kant is of the opinion that people are far from being or easily becoming capable of using their reason in religious matters without outside direction. But on the other hand, he says we have clear indications that the field has now been opened wherein men may freely deal with these things, and that the obstacles to general enlightenment or release from self-imposed tutelage are gradually being reduced. In this respect, this is the age of enlightenment, or the century of Frederick. So now we know, as we didn't know before, who the prince is, who the government is, and that's Frederick the Great. Largely described in the textbooks and by intellectuals of his time as an enlightened prince, an enlightened despot, benevolent despot. And of course Voltaire was so enchanted with Frederick that he went to visit Frederick in Prussia, and his experience with the real man, Frederick, was less than satisfactory, let's say. Right? He writes a little bit about what he thought of Frederick and the Prussians in the book Candide, right? That comedy. So what is the let's say raison d'etre, the reason for this paradox, and why Kant doesn't mind this notion of the freedom of public use of reason by intellectuals to other intellectuals, essentially, and the restriction of civil liberty. Right? He repeats again, right, and it's remarkable, right, the repetition of this phrase, bottom of page 6. But only one who is himself enlightened, who's not afraid of shadows, and has a numerous and well-disciplined army to assure public peace, can say, argue as much as you will and about what you will, only obey. Right? This is quote unquote. He's putting in the mouth of Frederick, who is himself enlightened, and who has a numerous and well-disciplined army to keep the peace. Here's the answer. A republic could not dare to say such a thing. Right? In a republic, for people to argue about everything, right, could unleash what? anarchy, right? Disintegration of public order. But only where you have this prince at the top with a big army can you allow this kind of freedom of conscience, again, for intellectual elites. Here is shown a strange and unexpected trend in human affairs, in which almost everything looked at in large is paradoxical. A greater degree of civil freedom appears advantageous to the freedom of mind of people, yet it places inescapable limitations on it. Right? If you have greater political freedom, you can't argue about everything, because the political connection would disintegrate. But in places, a lower degree of civil freedom, on the other hand, on the contrary, provides the mind with room for each man to extend himself to his full capacity. Right? People can argue, think about whatever they want, because ultimately it won't matter to political order. That will be kept by the enlightened prince. Well, that sort of brings us back to the question, and as we come towards a conclusion about what the thing says, and we'll look very briefly at its historical impact, but we need to understand better who these guardians are, right? We presume the guardians that kept people in their self-incurred tutelage were the older elites, political and religious elites in particular. But what does it mean to let's go right to the end of this. What does it mean to use one's reason without direction from another, right? Without direction from these guardians? How would that look, right? How do you start to reason without some direction from another? Now, you can call them guardians, right? If they're imposing their ideas on you, I suppose. But in cognitively, psychologically, right, we must consult, at least, the opinion of others, or our experience is going to be dramatically limited. And our ability to reason will be dramatically limited to our own experience of the world, which is limited. So it seems clear that the guardians of old times that Kant wants to do away with are not going to be done away with in principle. It's just that the new guardians will be the guardians of political order, right? The enlightened princes and their civil servants. But Kant doesn't see that as a problem, because he sees that as basically freeing up people to think whatever they want, as long as they can't do whatever they want, right? So there's a new kind of guardianship that's being advocated. I don't want to go too long in this. So let's look at what we might call the point of Kant's argument, and we can categorize his point, right, by seeing how he thinks, expresses himself, or must think implicitly about those basic philosophical religious questions. How is the universe? How is human nature? And what do we have to do to be happy? Well, to understand, right, there's not much reference of the nature of the universe here, and we might look to the rest of Kant's writings to understand how this thinking about public use of reason and civil control fit into his whole system of thought. We're not going to do that, except to mention, right, that Kant is frequently described as having established a Copernican revolution in thought. That is, he is claimed to have discovered the ultimate subjectivity of our experience, and the inability of us to know things in themselves. Well, there's a newsflash. Aristotle taught that, right, 1,500 years or more. What am I saying? 1,800 years, 1,900 years before Kant, right? The Greeks took for granted that our experience of the world was subjective. And, well, that's a big topic. But that subjectivity is Kant's justification for carving out freedom of discussion, at least among intellectuals, about things. As long as that subjectivity doesn't spin out of control, so to speak, right? The view of human nature, that we do get one quote in this essay about human nature, right, that people would be enlightened if it weren't for having been perverted, if their goodness wasn't perverted by restraint by these guardians. And right, so if we just remove that restraint on ideas, the goodness of men and of their ideas will come to the fore. We'll have progress, we'll have enlightenment. Right, we see that idea that in the marketplace of ideas, if it's totally free, right, you may have read John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. In the marketplace of ideas, if all ideas are allowed to circulate and everything like that, the best ones will come out on top. Well, that's an interesting, right, intellectual laissez-faire notion, right? But we see historically that the best ideas don't always come to the top. What a good or a best idea is itself disputed, right? Best and good is going to be determined by interest groups who see their own interests advanced by particular ideas. We see bad ideas come to the top all the time, right, with force even. Well, and what we have to do to be happy is have freedom of thinking, right, which can only be provided for by loss of political freedom. It's a very interesting paradox, but one with which Kant obviously is comfortable and actually, let's say, advocates. Well, where did these ideas come from? And we're going to be very brief about this, and I really want to only focus on the primary source of some of Kant's thinking about what a good government would look like that gave intellectual freedom and restricted political freedom. And the primary source for this is Plato's textbook, The Republic, right, which was well known ever since the time of Plato and studied by all the great intellectuals throughout Western history. And the term the guardians itself, right, comes from the Republic, because in Plato's abstract ideal of a city, right, the guardians are a class of people specially bred and trained to be rulers, right, to be enlightened despots. But here's the big problem, right? Plato didn't write the Republic as a recommendation for a political order. Quite the contrary. The Republic is a warning. It's many things, because it was the textbook used in his school, the academy, and it contains many different philosophical conundra that the students had to think through. But overall, there is a warning throughout the Republic that abstract reasoning, when applied to politics, creates dystopias, not utopias. And the guardians themselves in the Republic, it turns out, are deceived and controlled by some kind of Wizard of Oz that Plato leaves unnamed. But he knows very well, right, for such a world to exist, somebody has to be in charge, right, to maintain a kind of, let's say, control over the mechanism of society. So the rest of the development of modern intellectual history, in politics from Machiavelli to Rousseau, and in philosophy from Descartes especially, and Hume and Kant in his metaphysical and thinking, moral thinking, points in the direction, right, of this importance of political obedience. Why did that become such a, let's say, of an interest to political elites in Europe? It's because since the Middle Ages, Europe had been undergoing profound changes, starting with the climate, but then economically and socially and politically. And in politics, right, there was a movement from feudal monarchies that were quite weak and unable to, let's say, develop the resources of the territories that they controlled, to the absolute monarchs and absolute governments of the 18th century that had very strict control of many aspects of life in their territories. And those absolute governments, some were monarchies, some were republics, and some were parliamentary monarchies, constitutional monarchies, like England. And this shift in, these are the contexts that shifted, that made ideas like Kant's in demand, right? That explained and justified the limits on political liberty as being a positive good in order to free people to have intellectual or spiritual liberty, right? They can think and argue about whatever they want, just obey. Let's look at, you know, some of the big questions here. Yeah. So this notion that, right, the guardians are being replaced, you know, by intellectual or technological elites for the good of intellectual and spiritual freedom and progress that would accompany it, right? The material progress that would accompany freedom of thought, and presumably freedom of other sorts as well, economic freedom and social freedoms, but political freedom, right, would be carefully kept in check. Where did we, where have these ideas had an effect? Well, we can point to the immediate effect, right? And Kant's ideas were only part of a larger, you know, intellectual shift, a paradigm shift, if you will, in the 18th century, and within the context of the economic, social, and political shifts that accompanied it, that culminate in some ways in the French Revolution, right? Just 5 years after the publishing of what is Enlightenment and all the controversies that were going on at the time. Kant was something of an epicenter of this debate, but there were many, many participants across Europe agitating for these kinds of ideas. And, well, what difference does it make, right? The way that the French Revolution went, with the development of the Reign of Terror in particular, perhaps reveals the logical and practical endpoint of this kind of reasoning that gives political liberty virtually no importance, and does so in the name of a kind of spiritual liberty. And but as Lord Acton suggests, power tends to corrupt, right? Absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. And the Jacobins, the political radicals in the French Revolution, who you know, began by eliminating political freedoms, understood that the spiritual freedoms, the intellectual freedoms, had to be purged as well, because it's impossible to actually separate these things. The idea of being able to think whatever you want, but having to obey in civil matters is probably, let's say, a non-functional idea. And we haven't seen it work anywhere, which is some evidence on that case. So in conclusion, right, the historian of ideas' responsibility, and for that matter, every historian's responsibility is even to offer judgments, right, about how, not just what happened and how things happened and why they happened, but what difference does it make? Not just to the historical influences at the time, but what difference does it make to us today? Right? Otherwise, history, the study of the past, would just be antiquarianism. Interesting things to know that have no relevance to us. And so we find ourselves having to be a bit of philosophers and asking ourselves, what difference does that make to us today? And, that's a subject for the classroom and discussion, because sometimes, and perhaps always, the answers to that question are going to be subjective, and one hopes only based on evidence and reason, but still ultimately from discussion. So not just subjective conclusions, but intersubjective as we discuss and approximate an understanding of the way the universe is, the way human nature is, and what we have to do to be happy, even in studying the history of ideas. So thank you very much. I believe there will be a quiz attached to this session, and in the meantime, I wish you luck with the rest of the semester. Thank you.